Hello, U.S. History students, and welcome to our discussion on sectionalism from 1820 to 1860. Before we get started, it's important to understand exactly what sectionalism means in the context of U.S. history. And it's basically loyalty of someone to their own region or section of the country rather than to the nation as a whole. And so in this case, it's very much a loyalty to the South or a loyalty to the North in most cases, and very few it's a loyalty to the West. So from 1800 to 1860, the North and South become vastly different regions. Because of the First Industrial Revolution, the North becomes more factory-based, which if you look back, it kind of always has been more industrial, and that definition of industrialization has changed over time. But the North has, in this time, is much more industrial, more factories, more fabrication, and creation of goods. Whereas the South is traditionally much more agricultural and agrarian. And that doesn't change in this time period. They're still very agricultural and very agrarian. So King Cotton really transforms the South into a rural region. We've got slavery. We've had slavery in the United States since 1619. But the South has very little manufacturing and very few railroads. And previously, as we know, the major crops that were produced were tobacco, were indigo. And after Eli Whitney's invention of the cotton gin in 1794, so just before this period begins, cotton production booms because it's much easier to produce the cotton. Because what the cotton gin does is it speeds up the process of removing the seeds from the cotton fiber. So no longer is it a hand process where you've got to pick each individual seed out of the cotton itself. Now you got a machine that does it. So there's a lot more cotton that can be produced because of this mechanization. And that leads to there becoming much more cotton production within the South, hence leading to, by 1860, a majority of the crops grown in the South are cotton. And as you can see here, with this increase in production, we also see an increase in need for labor. And indentured servitude hasn't been around for a very long time by this point. And so the main source of that labor is slavery. So the slave population in 1820, as you can see, is it's a lot because each dot represents 200 slaves. But if you compare that to the 1860 map, you can see just how significant slavery is to the cotton production and how slavery intensifies and grows right along with the nation. The North has industrial factories. They've got more cities. They're much more urban than the South. They pay immigrant workers as opposed to relying predominantly on slave labor. They've got railroads to move their goods from each area in the nation, and they've got a much larger population. So this works to their advantage because we see more and more people getting jobs in these factories, and we'll see that continue after the Civil War into Reconstruction and the Gilded Age. The rise in factory workers increases even then. And so if we look here, our cities in 1820, we've got mostly our major cities that we had in the Revolutionary period. You've got Boston, New York, Philadelphia, Baltimore. But if you look at our population in 1860, those cities have boomed and more cities have popped up along the western frontier, as many would say. And this leads us into a production boom in industrial cities as well, because a lot of people are starting to move to those cities to get jobs. So with the inventions of things like the steamboat and horseless carriages, steam-powered trains that pull carriages, as you can see in the photo up here, and the expansion of the railroads throughout the country, we see a larger rise in moving goods around the country, because the ease of transportation also allows an ease for delivery of goods. So as you can see here, we've got a large number of railroads on our orange map in 1860, but the predominant area of those railroads is in the north. There are very few, very poorly connected railroads in the southern part of the United States. And so these regional differences increased sectionalism. And it's really an issue because as these two regions really form their own identities and begin to cultivate those identities and those differences, we start to see more and more Americans pulling away from the united front of the United States and relying or heavily focusing on their regional patriotism. And so from 1820 to 1850, sectionalism was pretty mild. It hasn't really gained its footing as much. And in many cases, it can be resolved by compromise pretty quickly. So let's take a look at that. The first major issue regarding slavery in the antebellum period focuses on the Missouri Compromise, or the statehood of what becomes Missouri in 1820. So Northerners and Southerners didn't want to upset the equal balance of free and slave, because at this point we've got an equal amount of free states and an equal amount of slave states. And that's one thing Northerners and Southerners agree on, is they don't want to disrupt that balance, that equilibrium. Northerners don't want slavery to spread beyond the Deep South, though. They want slavery to kind of stay where it's at. Southerners didn't think Congress had the power to stop slavery. So in their opinion, it's not blatantly written in the Constitution that slavery can't exist. And many of these Southerners are strict interpretation of the Constitution type people. And so based on that, they really don't think Congress has the power to stop them. So in 1820, Henry Clay negotiates the Missouri Compromise. Slavery is outlawed in all western territories above the latitude of 3630, which is essentially the modern day border between Missouri and Arkansas. So Missouri becomes a slave state, and Maine breaks away from Massachusetts because previously Maine had been part of, going all the way back to the beginning, part of the Massachusetts Bay Colony. And so, or the Massachusetts colonies. And so in 1820, in order to maintain that balance that nobody wanted to disrupt, within the compromise, Maine becomes its own state and it becomes a free state. So you've added two states to the Union, but that balance of power has not been disrupted because you have one free and one slave. And slavery now cannot spread north of that 3630 line. Then we get to the Jackson administration. And in this administration, in the 1830s, tariffs divide the North and South. So it's an added stressor. Tariffs, again, are taxes on imports and exports. So Southerners argue that tariffs benefited only the North and made manufacturers goods as well. So they're basically saying, like, these tariffs are only productive for the people that are sending manufactured goods out of the country and overseas. That's not fair to us because we're not doing that. So John C. Calhoun of South Carolina attempted a nullification and threatens secession. And so Calhoun's basically saying, like, your tariff is making manufactured goods way too expensive. It's not fair. And so we're just going to nullify it. We're going to ignore the fact that you've made these tariffs because we don't agree with them. And if you try to force us to go along with it, then we'll just secede. We'll pull out. We'll leave. We'll leave the Union. Jackson fights this and says basically this is a states' rights argument. Don't pretend like it doesn't exist, but like let's come to an agreement. And so within that time frame, we also see Nat Turner's rebellion. And in this, in 1831, Nat Turner freed slaves on several Virginia farms, and these slaves rebel against their white masters and killed 60 white people. And it increased the barbarity of slavery in the South, because it shows that slaves will eventually rebel against their masters and try to stand up for themselves. And so Southern whites respond by making the slave codes even more severe to try to maintain a control and even more of a hold on slavery. In the 1840s, westward expansion really brings the issue of slavery up yet again, though. Texas was not annexed for 9 years because it would unbalance that even number of free and slave states. So even though Texas they're asking to be annexed into the country, they want to become a state, it's refused for 9 years because, again, we don't want to disrupt that balance. The addition of Mexican cession after the Mexican-American War gives Southerners hope that slavery would spread to the Pacific Ocean. So Mexican cession, if you look behind the wording, Mexican cession is all of that blue territory between Texas and the Pacific Ocean. It makes up all of modern-day New Mexico, Arizona, California, Colorado, Nevada, and it's a huge amount of territory. We then get the Gadsden Purchase when we purchase the small part of the bottom of modern-day New Mexico and Arizona from Mexico in 1853. The addition of this huge amount of new Western land gives Southerners the hope that maybe they can move out there and they can take their slaves with them and slavery will expand from sea to sea. So in 1846, Northern Congressmen tried to pass what's called the Wilmot Proviso. And this law would have outlawed all slaves from Mexican cession. So basically saying you can't even take your slaves over there. One, we're not going to add these states as slave states, but also even if you want to move there, you can't take your slaves with you. But rather than voting along party lines, which the parties in this point are Democrats and Whigs, congressmen start voting according to their region, according to where they're from. And in 1848, the Free Soil Party was formed to keep slavery from spreading westward. So we start to see not only social sectionalism, but we start to see sectionalism really seeping into our nation's politics in this time frame. Free soilers were not abolitionists because they don't think Congress has the power to end slavery. These are very strict interpretation of the Constitution type people. And they're not abolitionists because they don't think Congress can get rid of slavery based on the Constitution, but they're against the expansion of slavery. So they're not saying, hey, we got to get rid of it, but they're saying, look, like, this can't keep going. We can't keep letting it spread. In 1850, California asked to enter the Union as a free state, and Southerners didn't want more free states, and they wanted slavery to be allowed in the Southwest Territories. So Southerners are starting to be very adamant about, we need slavery to expand westward, and we don't want any more free states. We want, slavery to continue. And California would kind of block that westward expansion because they can't get to the ocean if California is a free state. Northerners want to keep slavery out of the Southwest, and they wanted other laws to protect runaway slaves who made it to freedom in the North. And so 1850 really sees the height of that break between 1820 and 1850. It's like now it's really regional. Southerners don't want any more free states. They want to be able to expand slavery, while Northerners want to keep slavery in its bubble. Don't let it expand. And then if a slave does make it to freedom in the North, let them be free. Let them have that freedom that they so strongly want. So the Compromise of 1850 solves the sectional dispute between North and South as far as slave states go. Slavery is ended in Washington, D.C., so slaves are banned from the capital. California enters as a free state, so now Texas and California have that balance. And the people of Utah and New Mexico could vote to allow or ban slavery. So they're basically allowing those territories to have popular sovereignty, the right to govern their territories the way they see fit. And stronger fugitive slave law was created that allowed Southerners to recapture their slaves in the North. So basically, let's say a slave escapes from a plantation in South Carolina and they make it all the way to Pennsylvania. If that slave is captured in Pennsylvania by basically a bounty hunter and returned to South Carolina, then they can take, that slave owner can take that slave back. And in many cases, those slaves were harshly punished for running away. And so on our slide here, I've got a reproduction of an advertisement, and it says $100 reward. Run away from the subscriber on the 27th of July, my black woman named Emily, 17 years of age, well-grown, black color, having a whining voice. She took with her one dark callus and one blue and white dress, a red corded gingham bonnet, a white striped shawl, slippers. I will pay the above reward if taken near the Ohio River on the Kentucky side, or $300 if taken in the state of Ohio and delivered to me near Lewisburg, Mason County, Kentucky. August 4th, 1853. So this man had a 17-year-old slave named Emily who escaped from his plantation in Kentucky, and he wants her back. So if she's captured on the Kentucky side, he'll pay $100. But if some fool let her slip into Ohio, which, as you can see by our map, is a free state, then he'll pay $300 to get her back. And he goes into very broad detail of what she took with her, what she was wearing, so that it would be easier for people to identify her. And this was what people did. They put these in the newspaper, and then people who wanted the money would go out and hunt the slaves and try to bring them back so they could collect the money. So in the Compromise of 1850, you've got three main characters: Henry Clay, Daniel Webster, and John Calhoun. Webster strongly supports Clay's compromise. He left the Senate before Stephen Douglas could engineer the passage of all provisions in the compromise, so he's not really there for the whole thing. Clay offers his compromise to the Senate in January of 1850, and in his efforts to save the Union, so to speak, Henry Clay becomes the Great Compromiser, and that's his nickname moving forward. And then John C. Calhoun, who's a Southerner, opposes the compromise, but he dies 2 months after Clay proposes it. So moving forward, we've got differences in regional economies and the use of slavery, westward expansion, the entry of new states into the Union, and then growing abolition in the North. But each time a dispute is threatened, a compromise is reached before 1850. Our last major compromise is 1850. So for that 30-year period, things are handled. They're okay. But from 1850 to 1856, the growth of abolitionism and westward expansion intensifies the question of the morality of slavery. Is it morally okay to hold humans in bondage? So abolitionists and many Northerners despise the Compromise of 1850. The Fugitive Slave Law allows runaway slaves and even sometimes free Black people to be recaptured and re-enslaved. And this really makes the abolitionists mad. It's like, these people are trying to make a better life for themselves, and you're going to recapture them for a little bit of money? Northerners form vigilante committees to protect these runaway slaves. This is kind of where we get the Underground Railroad, which we'll talk about here in a couple minutes. And abolitionism really grows in the North. This belief that it's morally wrong to keep humans in bondage. And it starts to see, like, I guess you could say counter advertisements, where, you know, you've got your advertisements in the newspaper wanting people to return slaves. But then you've got some like this, where it says, "Caution, colored people of Boston, one and all. You are hereby respectfully cautioned and advised to avoid conversing with the watchmen and police officers of Boston. For since the recent order of the mayor and aldermen, they are empowered to act as kidnappers and slave catchers, and they have already been actually employed in the kidnapping and catching and keeping slaves. Therefore, if you value your liberty and the welfare of the fugitives among you, shun them in every possible manner, as so many hounds on the track of the most unfortunate of your race. Keep a sharp lookout for kidnappers and have top eye open." And this is from April 24th of 1851. So this really just goes to show that there are some people that are looking out to try to keep these people from being captured and enslaved. William Lloyd Garrison forms the American Anti-Slavery Society, and he publishes a newspaper called The Liberator. And in this newspaper, Garrison appeals to the moral conscience of its readers and urges them to demand immediate freeing of slaves. And in it, it also promotes women's rights, which is another issue that kind of splits the American abolition movement, but it's mostly essentially abolitionist propaganda, trying to get people to be more on the abolitionist side. Also in this time period, we start to see the Northern Star published, which is published by a freed slave by the name of Frederick Douglass, who's going to become a very prominent figure in the African American abolitionist movement. And in the Northern Star, which Douglass was actually inspired to start producing after reading The Liberator, he really advocates, again, just like in The Liberator, anti-slavery and abolition. And his thoughts towards political inaction changed when he attends the National Convention of Colored Citizens, which is an anti-slavery convention in Buffalo. And he really starts to see just how important it is that independent action start going against American slavery. And it remained one of the leading issues of change for Douglass. And so he writes this newspaper with the intention of getting more and more people to engage in the anti-slavery movement politically and try to get these people to fight to get rid of slavery in the United States. And when questioned on his decision to create this newspaper, Douglass is said to have responded, "I still see before me a life of toil and trials, but justice must be done. The truth must be told. I will not be silent." Also, during this time period, the Underground Railroad becomes extremely important. And this is a series of safe houses to help slaves escape to freedom. Now, contrary to its name, it's not an actual railroad. What they would do is there was a series of houses, privately owned homes in most cases, and the people there would hide the slaves until dark in many cases, and they would then help them to escape to the next safe house. So it's just a series of houses that were helping these people escape to the north. And as you can see our map here, there's safe houses mostly along the borders, but also along the coast. So like there's some in Norfolk, Newburgh, North Carolina, Charleston, that are helping these people escape by water to get to the north. And one of the main conductors on the Underground Railroad is a woman named Harriet Tubman, very famous for her work in this very important movement. She made 19 trips south to lead 300 slaves to freedom through this network of safe houses. She could have been caught. She could have been killed. She didn't care. She wanted to make sure these people were safe. And how they would make sure of this and know like when and where to go is they would sew secret messages into quilts. And so here's a couple of examples of things that they would sew into these quilts, these patterns. The first one is the blue area, and it's called the monkey wrench. And this pattern told slaves to prepare to flee, like get ready to go. So if slaves saw this, they would know what it meant, but their white owners would not. They would just think it's a pattern on a quilt. So it was a very ingenious way of getting them information they needed in a safe manner. And the green one is called the drunkard path, and it warned escapees not to follow a straight route. Like, don't go straight, like weave, go to different areas. Don't go in a straight line because it's easier to find you. And then in 1852, Harriet Beecher Stowe publishes a book called Uncle Tom's Cabin. And this book depicted slavery as a moral evil and was yet another piece of literature that inspired many in the North to join the abolitionist movement. And this becomes the best-selling book of the 19th century. it actually was banned in some places because of its abolitionist propaganda, as many saw it. And then we get to Stephen Douglas's Kansas-Nebraska Act. The law was used in this region to promote popular sovereignty and to give the residents of that territory the right to vote to determine whether their section of the country would have slavery or not. And to do this, Congress ended the Missouri Compromise, or repealed it. And that line at 3630 in the Western Territory no longer denoted whether slavery was okay or not. And this allows for the people in the Kansas and Nebraska territories to vote for themselves. Northerners were outraged by this. They were furious. Congress allows slavery to spread into an area where slavery was already outlawed. We already got rid of it there. What in the world are you doing? And popular sovereignty actually fails to settle the slavery in the West, which is what Douglas really thought was going to happen. Popular sovereignty let them vote whether they want it or not, and that's going to end the issue here and now. So because of this, Northerners formed the Republican Party in 1854 and became committed to the free soil movement. So this is the beginnings of the Republican and Democrat parties that we have now. When a vote was held in Kansas in 1855 to decide on slavery, thousands of people from Missouri illegally voted. Like, they crossed the border into Kansas and voted because they wanted Kansas to be a slave state. Because Missouri was a slave state, Kansas Territory was right next door to them. We need to expand slavery. So these people intentionally committed voter fraud, go into this region, and vote for slavery. The illegal vote gave Kansas slavery when its actual residents didn't want it. The people who actually lived there and actually got the legal right to vote in this election didn't want slavery. But because so many people from Missouri crossed the border and voted when they weren't allowed to, slavery became legal in Kansas. So in 1856, war between Kansas and Missouri breaks out. We call this now, looking back, Bleeding Kansas, because the people in Kansas are furious. They're like, we don't want slavery. You idiots came over here and voted when you weren't supposed to, and now we have slavery. So the Kansas people basically fought against the Missouri people over those illegal votes and the fact that now slavery was okay in Kansas. All right, so from 1850 to 1856, the growth of abolitionism due to the Fugitive Slave Law, Uncle Tom's Cabin, the Kansas-Nebraska Act, the Liberator, the North Star, the birth of regional, not national political parties like the Republicans, and sectional tensions becoming so bad that compromise isn't even an option, leads us into our next section. From 1856 to 1860, the slave issue becomes irreconcilable and really leads to the Civil War in 1861. So the election of 1856 was the first time in which political parties represent regions of the country, not the nation. So Republicans represent the North, Democrats the South. So this is the first election that we see a red and blue map like we do today. Not to say that there's not additional third parties like there is now. There's always generally third parties. But the two main political parties in the nation are now the Republicans and the Democrats. And so in this time, again, Republicans represent the North, the abolition, the ban on the expansion of slavery. Democrats represent the South, the keep slavery going, states' rights kind of concept. Slavery becomes the most important political issue in that election, and the election is between Buchanan and Fremont. So even though the Republicans lose in 1856, they realize they have enough electoral college votes to win the presidency without Southern support. That's very key. So if all of the northern states band together, they can win the electoral college without a single Southern vote. And this is going to be very important as we move forward. So keep that in mind. So in 1857, a slave named Dred Scott sued for his freedom after traveling with his master from Missouri to Wisconsin. So they originally lived in Missouri, which is a slave state. And so in Missouri, he's held in bondage. But his master moves him to Wisconsin, which is a free state. And so the reason that Scott is suing is he basically says, I now live in a free state, therefore I should be free. The Dred Scott case presents the Supreme Court with two main questions. Does Congress have the power to decide slavery in territories? And is the Missouri Compromise constitutional? In Dred Scott v. Sanford, 1857, the Supreme Court rules that Dred Scott had no right to sue because Black people are not citizens. So regardless of whether he lives in a free state or not, he's not a citizen, therefore he doesn't have the right to sue another citizen. And then as far as the other questions, Congress does not have the power to stop slavery in the Western territories because slavery is not mentioned in the Constitution at this point. And the Missouri Compromise is unconstitutional. So Northern abolitionists are furious. They're so angry over this case. You moved a slave from a slave state to a free state, and now you're saying that he can't even be free. And not only that, you're going back and ruling a previous compromise unconstitutional. So that basically means that slavery can continue in the territories. And also you're saying that Congress doesn't have the power to stop it. So how are we going to stop slavery? So this really angers the Northern people. So in 1858, Democrat Stephen Douglas ran against Republican Abraham Lincoln for Illinois Senate. Lincoln is a lawyer from Illinois. He has no actual political experience up to this point. He's a poor kid, didn't go to what we would consider school. So he's a self-taught man, becomes a lawyer in his own right, and he's really unknown at this time. But during that campaign, he argues that Congress must stop the spread of slavery. So he wholeheartedly believes in the free soil argument. Lincoln loses the election, though. So he doesn't actually get his senatorship yet. He does become a senator. But at this point, he doesn't get the election. But his argument against slavery makes him extremely popular to the Northern people. Because here's a man who strongly believes that in order for us to be united, slavery must end. And he, in this campaign, makes one of his famous speeches. And in this speech, he says, "A house divided against itself cannot stand. I believe this government cannot endure permanently half slave and half free." This is the man who becomes known as the Great Emancipator, saying this in 1858, which is extremely poignant. A year later, abolitionist John Brown leads an unsuccessful raid on a federal armory at Harper's Ferry, Virginia. And an armory is like where they keep all the weapons. And his purpose in this is to free the slaves in a massive slave uprising. He wants to make sure that all these slaves get weapons and fight against their white masters and get what they need. Brown was caught and executed, but he was seen as a martyr in the North. What that means is he's seen as like somebody who gave his life for the cause. And that cause being abolition. Southerners believe the Northerners were using violence to end slavery. It's like, okay, so now you're resorting to violence instead of politics? Okay, I see where you're going with this. The election of 1860 was the final straw. Republicans nominate that free soil thinking Republican who fought against Douglas in 1858 and lost. He was still on their minds 2 years later. And they agree with him. Let's end slavery so we can have a strong national government, a very northern way of thinking. And Democrats in the North and South are split over the issues of slavery. But remember back to that 1856 election, the Republicans noticed that they had enough electoral college votes to win. So Northern Democrats nominate Stephen Douglas, same guy that Lincoln lost to in the Senate race, and they believe that he's going to argue for popular sovereignty, the right for each section to be able to vote how they see fit. Southern Democrats nominate John Breckinridge, who argues for states' rights and the protection of slavery. So you've got a four-party, because there's the Constitutional Union Party thrown in there too. They're not very popular, but they're in there. So you've got a four-party vote. It's predominantly between Lincoln and Douglas, though. Lincoln wins 59% of the Electoral College votes. So he wins 180 of a total of 303, which is a majority. So in December of 1860, just a month after the election, a month after Lincoln has secured his presidency, South Carolina becomes the first state to secede from the Union, which means they break away, they leave. In 1861, more Southern states begin to secede, and the Civil War between North and South begins in April of 1861. So looking at our timeline, we get the Missouri Compromise, and then the Compromise of 1850, and then the Kansas-Nebraska Act. And then we see the Wilmot Proviso and Bleeding Kansas, the caning of Charles Sumner on the floor of Congress, which is also because of this sectionalism argument. And then you see Dred Scott, he's like, hey, look, I'm living in a free state now, therefore I'm free, right? And he sues, and of course he loses because he's African American. And all of this culminates in the election of 1860, which is that final straw, that spark that finally gets the South to say, look, clearly we can't do this. Clearly we're two separate ends of the same spectrum. So we're out. And this leads us into the Civil War, which we will talk about in our next video. Thank you for watching, and I hope you have a great day.